All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Happy Monday and welcome to what has become one of my favorite CCPO-ICAR seminars, an opportunity for us to listen and learn about the research undertaken by a range of ODU graduate students with support from Virginia Sea Grant. So today we're going to have 3 presentations by Ella DiPetto, Robin Dunbar, and Zlatka Rebolleda Sanchez. And they will present their research, and I hope that you'll learn as much about the different types of research, as well as think of this as an opportunity potentially to also encourage your students to apply for Virginia Sea Grant funding to support their research. We'll go ahead and get started with Ella, and if possible, I'd like to keep all of the questions until the end so that all 3 of our presenters can answer questions. So, Ella, go ahead.
Thank you. All right, let me share the screen. Can everybody see this?
Looks good.
Awesome. Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Dr. Yusuf, for the introduction. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Ella. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at ODU studying ecological sciences. I'm going to give you a brief background of myself, talk about the research that I'm conducting at ODU, including 2 ongoing projects and 1 future project partially funded through Virginia Sea Grant. A little bit about myself. I received my bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation from Virginia Tech in 2018. At that time, I was interested in gaining field experience wherever I could, and I spent the next few years at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, where I worked on a variety of bird conservation projects, including the island scrub jay in California and the gray catbird in Washington, D.C. I worked mainly on species conservation issues, trying to understand the migration, breeding, and social behavior of these species. I then began to broaden my focus to wetland birds, like this species of concern, the black rail. Working for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, I was still focused on conservation per se, but this project took a much broader approach, working to understand the relationship between these species and their habitat, mainly high marsh wetland systems. It was this job where I really fell in love with coastal ecosystems, the complexities and interactions among different living and non-living components. These are some of the photos of the beautiful places that I worked at that time in the Ace Basin Natural Wildlife Refuge in South Carolina, which represents one of the largest undeveloped wetland ecosystems remaining on the East Coast. Working within these habitats shifted my way of thinking towards an ecosystem-based approach. And following the conclusion of that job, I stayed within the state government to join the South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program, or SCORE, whose mission was to restore coastal oysters and salt marsh habitats in combination with public involvement in education. So I ran a lot of hands-on volunteer events, working with the community to restore their natural resources. Through SCORE, this really opened my eyes to the intersection of people and nature. We can't treat ourselves as separate entities from the environment. We are inextricably linked. I began to understand the immense value that healthy coastal ecosystems have for people and the variety of services that they provide, including water filtration, carbon storage, storm protection, a lot of economically important fish and commercial fish species, tourism, and recreation. In fact, wetlands provide an annual $23 billion in protective services, and that doesn't cover all of the other ecosystem services they provide that I mentioned, like the economically important fishery and tourism industries. And as is sadly the case for many of the world's ecosystems, coastal wetlands are facing severe threats, with an estimated 80,000 acres of coastal wetlands lost each year from development, draining, erosion, sea level rise, and land subsidence. So all of these experiences really culminated in an understanding of the importance of coastal ecosystems, and I wanted to help advance the field of coastal resilience using nature to protect coastal societies. This drove my decision to return back to graduate school, and I started my graduate program at ODU in the fall of 2021, joining the Walters Lab, where I work under Dr. Eric Walters. And yes, as you may guess from the logo, this lab focuses a lot on bird conservation. I didn't truly leave my roots, but it's a very diverse lab. If you go to our lab website, you'll see a graphic of all the diverse topics we cover, ranging from species to community level topics. Many of our students work with bird populations and data from across the country, and across the globe, but we also focused on key ecological questions in a range of systems and different habitats. However, that graphic on our lab page is outdated, and if it had been updated since I joined the lab, you might see a couple of different words pop up, like living shorelines, resilience, coastlines, and people. That's to say, the big picture of my work is to better understand the connection between people and nature, especially in developed coastal areas, and apply this to coastal resilience. In practice, what that looks like, my research at ODU focuses on living shorelines, which are a newer shoreline protection technique that emphasizes natural materials to stabilize shorelines. There's growing interest in living shorelines because of their ecological benefits compared to traditional hard shoreline protection techniques like a bulkhead or a seawall, but also because of their potential to adapt with climate change. A local design in our region of a living shoreline often considers the addition of sand fill, vegetation planting, and the combination of an oyster structure, which both stabilizes the shoreline and provides habitat for oysters, for larval oysters to land on and grow. And this is an additional focus of living shorelines in certain regions, especially like those within the Chesapeake Bay, where oyster populations are at a small fraction of their historical numbers. There's a huge diversity of living shoreline materials and designs. This image shows just a few different types of hybrid living shorelines that use not only natural materials, but some combination of structure that serves to aid in coastal protection, like those oyster structures that I mentioned. There's a variety of different techniques and materials, from recycled oyster shells to different concrete designs and stones. For my research, I specifically focus on those oyster-based living shorelines. One of my first research projects investigates habitat provided for birds and mammals by oyster-based living shorelines. There's little known about how birds and mammals respond to living shoreline restoration, even though wildlife habitat is often one of the additional benefits of these types of projects that they suggest and assume that these living shorelines promote. For this project, I'm comparing species diversity, abundance, and habitat value along living shorelines compared to shorelines that have not been restored. We used wildlife cameras at 10 different living shorelines across Hampton Roads. And while the study is currently in the data analysis phase, I wanted to briefly share with you some of the animals that we saw using the living shorelines, as well as some of the preliminary results. Starting off with who was using these living shorelines, largely it was wading birds, like the great blue heron on that left-hand image and the yellow-crowned night heron on the right. We have a variety of different waterfowl species that use these shorelines, and this may come as a surprise, but raccoons were actually our #1 frequent visitor of living shorelines, often at night, like in these photos here. Some less common, but really more exciting photographs that the trail cameras picked up are species like bald eagles, and on the right, we have a North American river otter, both actually using the oyster structures themselves. Preliminary results show that birds and mammals are found more frequently along living shorelines than those unrestored reference areas. But not only are these species using living shorelines more, but when they are at living shorelines, they are foraging for food more often too. So the below photos show the variety of different food items that were seen on camera: crustaceans, shrimp, fish, and on the right-hand side, that's actually a muskrat consuming some vegetation. So preliminary data is really important, and these implications for understanding the habitat value of these projects as the study continues to be analyzed. Moving on to a second project, I'm also really interested in the shoreline protection value that living shorelines are providing to people, especially these living shorelines on small-scale residential properties. With the threats of erosion, sea level rise, and storms, reducing vulnerability of coastal property is a top priority within any coastal community. So this project shifts from an ecosystem benefits of wildlife habitat to look at the coastal protection benefits. I'm monitoring 5 living shorelines before and after restoration, like these photos here taken at one of these study sites, before on the left and after restoration on the right. These projects were all constructed last year, spring and summer of 2023. And in that post-restoration photo, you can see all of those design features I mentioned: the oyster structures, the sand fill, and the planted vegetation. I will be measuring 4 metrics of shoreline protection: wave attenuation, oyster recruitment, vegetation growth, and shoreline elevation, following those for 2 years. And this project is ongoing, and I hope to be able to provide some insight into the trajectory of these smaller scale residential living shorelines in terms of their ability to protect land. I'd now like to shift gears and discuss a future project that is funded by the American Philosophical Society and Virginia Sea Grant. In the field of living shorelines, we have 2 major regions of knowledge production. We have the on-the-ground practitioners building the shorelines day in and day out, and we have the researchers monitoring and running experiments and observational studies. We have what we call a science practice gap, and while research published within academic journals and at conferences can be shared pretty easily, there are barriers in place for practitioners to share the knowledge in the same capacity. This type of knowledge is not always suitable for academic journals, but crucial to advancing living shoreline effectiveness all the same, and I'd like to find a way to facilitate these voices being heard. I'm targeting coastal states in the mid-Atlantic to the Gulf Coast, those who tend to be installing similar types of living shorelines, and I'm currently in the partner acquisition phase, reaching out to practitioners within these states to participate in this project. Many entities in the living shoreline field are involved in the production of knowledge, from industry to government, from nonprofit to academic, and my project seeks to provide a platform for discussion and collaboration among these different practitioner groups. These are just a few examples of existing and developing partnerships from across the region in the study. So from the Gulf Coast, like Mississippi State University, to the Northern Mid-Atlantic, like the Delaware Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. And I'm hoping that this list will continue to grow. The first goal of this study is to connect and unify practitioner voices to synthesize knowledge on living shoreline design, implementation, and monitoring. And secondly, to provide a platform for to share challenges and best practices. This research is capacity building, collaborative, and practitioner focused. So the objectives may change in real time based on what would be most helpful to the practitioners themselves. And so that's why these objectives start off so broad, is that outcomes can be collaboratively produced depending on the need. To achieve my goals, I will conduct in-person interviews, followed by virtual roundtable discussions. And the primary identified outcome includes a knowledge synthesis report. This report will allow for communication of challenges, failures, successes, best practices, and recommendations from practitioners to enhance shared knowledge concerning living shoreline design, implementation, and monitoring. And I also wish to create a co-produced sustainable plan for continual information sharing to ensure that new experiences over time can continue to be learned from, so that no matter what type of living shoreline or what region you're in, we can work towards a unified goal. This project is still in its early stages, so if you have feedback or if you are a practitioner interested in being involved, I would really love to hear from you. Thank you for your time. I want to make a huge shout out to all of the sources of funding for these 3 projects that I mentioned: my graduate committee, my advisor, Dr. Eric L. Walters, my research lab, and everyone who had many money days in the field assisting me. I'm happy to take questions, although I think Dr. Yusuf said we're going to leave those toward the end, but I just wanted to leave with my contact information, my email, my website, and my Twitter. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon. Again, I'm Robin Dunbar. I'm an ODU PhD candidate in public administration and policy, graduating this May. Yay. So I was awarded a Virginia Sea Grant mini grant. It's $5,000, and that helped cover my professional development and transcription services. I did a qualitative case study. And I'm also the Deputy Director of Education for the nonprofit Elizabeth River Project. We're working to restore one of the most historically polluted Chesapeake Bay rivers that runs through Norfolk, Portsmouth, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach. So my career has included the fusion of art and science. And today I'm going to kick off this afternoon with a brief environmental policy timeline from art and science perspective. Art and science are both human attempts to comprehend and then explain the world around us. So this can be extremely important, especially with dynamic, complex, wicked problems that often include multiple outcomes versus one solution. I'll move pretty quickly through the presentation to include a glimpse of art that relates to marine debris, and then onto my research. So let's begin with this 1886 painting called The Storm, where you can see a ship mast being tossed and churned about in a choppy sea. But we can go back even further for glimpses of items we see today in our oceans, such as fish nets in Egypt's 6th dynasty, or sewers leading to our rivers like the ones in Rome that led to the Tiber River over 2,700 years ago. And in the 1st century BC, we see fishing poles with lines and nets utilized on the Nile. And even in one of the most famous maps, the Carta Marina from 1500s, shows barrels floating amongst sea creatures. Here, Claude Monet shows us fishing nets in France. And Odysseus tells us in Homer's Odyssey that Zeus thundered and hurled his lightning at the ship, ripped the sides from the keel, and snapped the mast to meet the whirlpool's terror. Here we see a mast adrift in famous battles in the 1600s. And closer to home in the Boston Harbor, we see floating barrels. In the 1900s, William Waterhouse shows us how debris is pushed and swept to the shore. And here, a very famous Belgian painter and military officer included in his most famous masterpiece, Floating Ship Debris. And then Winslow Homer reminds us of fishing nets. Although the word gyre is used in the 1500s, it was introduced again in 1870 in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Commander Fontaine Maury described floating debris as if any floating substance be put in a basin and a circular motion be given to the water. All the light substances will be found crowding together near the center of the pool, and the Sargasso Sea is the center of the world. Also, in this 1914 edition includes illustrations of the Florida, an abandoned derelict vessel. Here is Jackson Pollock, gives us his version of a debris-filled sea with sea change that was inspired by Shakespeare's poem, The Tempest, that was supposedly inspired by the Virginia Company's sea venture of a shipwreck near Bermuda. And then in the 1800s, we moved to the art of plastics, displayed here in London as a new innovation. This was followed in the 1900s by literary art such as Rachel Carson's trilogy about the sea that began with an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 1937, where she argues that to sense the world of waters, we must shed our human perceptions of length and breadth and time and place and enter vicariously into a universe of all-pervading water. Then in 1872, we transitioned to the art of power, persuasion, and policymaking with President Ulysses S. Grant signing the Yellowstone Act, followed by the Rivers and Harbor Act of 1899, that is most relevant with my research on the Elizabeth River. In 1948, followed the Water Pollution Control Act, and in 1956, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act signed by President Kennedy. But one of the most important moments was when the world got a complete view of the blue planet. On the left is the first color image of the full Earth in 1966 from the DODGE, the Department of Defense Gravity Experiment satellite. On the right is the blue marble image taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on their way to the moon, December 7th, 1972. Then from there, in the 70s, became the rise of the environmental movement, including the formation of NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And from there, the Clean Water Act of 1972, striving for all surface waters to be fishable and swimmable, and giving the EPA the authority to regulate industrial point sources of pollution. To the Save Our Seas 2020 Act that requires NOAA to coordinate a marine debris program, to the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan, its strategy for stakeholders in multiple sectors to work together to reduce marine debris. And although policies and laws may be in place, work still needs to be done. For example, Virginia's littering legislation began with a 1979 report with limited data only on about 20 sites and 2 miles of roads. Since Virginia has approved legislation on plastic bags, balloon releases, and polystyrene, but not all of Virginia has adopted them. For example, only 8 counties have adopted the plastic bag fee. In addition, there are 4 strategies that include goals for clean water and marine debris removal in Virginia. That includes the Clean Water Act, the Marine Debris Reduction Plan, the Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Action Plan, and then rivers most often have strategies such as Elizabeth River's Watershed Action Plan, or Elizabeth. Now, marine debris is a wicked problem. It was a term coined actually by Riddle and Weber in the 70s that includes 10 attributes, such as problems lack one solution, they're complex. And we know marine debris travels and doesn't stay put, and stakeholders have different views and goals. And this can be an obstacle when there's a large amount of stakeholders that are needed for consensus. And marine debris doesn't just affect, our rivers, but also everything, in fact. Pictured here is an owl caught in fishing line that was hanging from tree branches near a local fishing hole. This owl survived, but the rescue required special equipment. And abandoned fishing gear is one of the deadliest forms of marine debris to aquatic life. And with challenges comes innovation, the marriage of art and science. Some innovations are expensive and require manpower, such as the netting jellybot on the left that requires volunteers. Or then there's Mr. Trash Wheel on the right, a skimmer located in the Baltimore Harbor. It can cost up to $1 million. Then there's the barrier device, the interceptor, that requires bodies of water to be closed, or trash trappers, such as this one that was inspired by biomimicry on the right. That's how whales filter with their baleen. Utilizing GPS devices can be affordable and beneficial in identifying fishing nets, but they require vessels to retrieve the nets, which can be costly. And most challenging is bottom retrieval. That's expensive and requires heavy equipment and technology. And there are additional prototypes out there, such as the bubble barrier. It was launched in Amsterdam, made for rivers and canals, but the challenges include depth, fish, and debris collection. And that brings us to Old Dominion University's home river, where these innovations may not be appropriate. Virginia's Elizabeth River is one of the closest rivers to the Atlantic Ocean and is found at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. In the 1600s, Captain John Smith noted the shores were lined with the tallest pine and fir trees he had ever seen. Today, it's home to the world's largest naval facility, the oldest working shipyards, and a world-class port. And regarding water quality, most research on the Elizabeth River has focused on legacy issues that included heavy metals noted as PAHs and PCBs that have settled to the bottom of the river. Additional gaps include macro large marine debris, their sources, their types, where they're accumulating, and their impacts. Hence, the narrative of the marine debris in the Elizabeth River is unknown. And research shows there is relevance to better understanding marine debris in industrial rivers and ports for economic implications, navigational hazards, and policy support. Research shows that river emissions account for up to 4 million metric tons of debris annually, with 80% originating from land and being transported by rivers that can be transported very long distances. And stakeholder participation is crucial in solving environmental problems, especially wicked ones, such as marine debris. Systemic change is needed, along with ensuring all key stakeholders are informed of the magnitude of the problem, and they participate to minimize risk of policy failure. So what I wanted to know with my research is, does the Elizabeth River have a marine debris problem? And what's the story? So my research included 3 questions. What are the views of stakeholders from multiple sectors on the marine debris problems at the mouth of the Elizabeth River? Which stakeholders are considered in addressing marine debris issues? And what is the match between their views and the policies to address the marine debris? So I implemented a qualitative study with post-positivist ontology and epistemological positions of empiricism and constructivism. The narrative policy framework has post-positivist origins, and empirical elements were acknowledged since policymakers' stories have components that are engineered with their ideas. Although the narrative policy framework began with a quantitative approach, qualitative approaches can be applied and are encouraged to broaden the research and the knowledge. So I applied the qualitative narrative policy framework. It's rather a new framework, although the narrative policy framework came about in 2010. Qualitative approaches was 2016. And it's based on the idea that policy narratives are created by stakeholders to influence public policy and seek a deeper understanding of new knowledge. So stories can offer hope to complex, wicked problems, and policy problems have narratives with a beginning, middle, end, a transformation, a moral, an action, or a result. The plot can include a storyline with blame, decline, conspiracy, and change. There can be characters like heroes, villains, and victims. And the moral is often the solution to the problem, or the outcome that can include recommendations, strategies, new policies, or amendments. I implemented in-depth interviews with 31 stakeholders from 9 sectors that included government, public, private, nonprofit, academic, military, resident, volunteer, and fisher sectors. And the framework worked. Yay, an overall narrative did emerge. In fact, the Elizabeth River does have a marine debris problem. And according to the 9 sectors in this study, they said it's actually terrible. In addition, they said that the debris they most frequently see is plastics, and they believe it originates with people. And all the stakeholders I interviewed were taking action to remove the marine debris as heroes, but they also responded as victims, saying there was too much marine debris to manage. Their stories included a plot of interference, where the marine debris was seen as a problem, but gets better due to their actions as heroes, but then they face barriers and lack resources and policies. The stakeholders' view on plastics is in agreement with a 2022 poll with 900 Virginia registered voters, where 55% ranked plastics floating in the ocean the second highest serious issue under inflation and the cost of living. So with this limited time to review my research, I'd like to share one part of the story that emerged, where stakeholders recommended policies be developed. Stakeholders shared that marine debris in the Elizabeth River increases after rain, tidal, and flood events. And areas are often out of sight and out of mind, in areas such as under bridges. This is 20 feet down, it's under a bridge, and here a hawk was caught in the spokes of the abandoned bicycle. He did get loose, but it was brought to a nearby organization's attention that is still trying to find out who is responsible for cleaning up this site. And government, military, and private stakeholders told me about a site at a local terminal where I was taken on a research vessel to view by water and then onto the terminal to see by land. Here you can see plastics, polystyrene, and wood. You can see marine grade rope or line that can cause expensive damage to vessels and equipment. And this site has years of accumulation of debris, and it's piled up layer upon layer. And because not being removed, it begins to break down with unknown implications to the river quality as microplastics. This accumulation area is on a site without public access, and because it has years of accumulation, it will take a grand strategy to find a solution. And that is part of Elizabeth's River story. Another is the aging infrastructure. The pilings and the pieces of docks that are dangerous to navigation that accumulate after the flood events and the storms. Although they shared they haven't done a great job telling their story, the U.S. Corps of Engineers are our heroes. They have congressional authorization and funding to daily keep the channel safe and navigable, which is a great part of Elizabeth River's story. The Elizabeth River is one of 5 harbors in the nation that has this authorization that began with the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act. And although they are mainly focused on large debris, they too don't like the floating plastic, but their authorization and funding only focus on debris that can cause vessel accidents and damage in the channel. So what about the shorelines and the wetlands and the accumulation areas that are inaccessible? Well, that's part of the story that I will share during my defense in April, but I will share that my study did answer all 3 research questions and policies were recommended. But for now, we know the Elizabeth River story has changed over time, and it now includes a new chapter where together we will find a solution to this marine debris pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And now we will transition to our last presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Just one second, I think. Can you see my screen and the presentation well?
Looks good.
Perfect. Okay. I am Zlatka, and today we're going to talk about carbon dynamics in Virginia salt marshes with a spatial variability perspective. So we have mentioned a lot about salt marshes, but just a brief reminder, they're essential coastal environments and they have very specific conditions. They're flooded and drained by saltwater, running by the tides. And the thing that I love most about them is all the amazing ecosystem services they provide. And could be about nutrient cycling or provision of habitat, also wave attenuation and erosion control, but I want to focus on the climate regulation portion of it. Why? Because of the blue carbon. So blue carbon is the carbon sequestered and stored in vegetated coastal ecosystems. And it can be seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. Why blue carbon matters, why it's important? Well, the carbon stored in these ecosystems is way higher than in many others. If we compare it with rainforests, for example, the rate that it sequesters is 10 times higher. And it's stored between 3 to 5 times more carbon in these ecosystems. And they have these key different pools. So in the above ground biomass, in the stems and the leaves of the plants, they store carbon, also in the root section, so in the below ground biomass, and then in the sediments and the soil. So this is very important for climate change mitigation, and it's a technique when we are conserving, restoring, and utilizing these vegetative coastal habitats, but we need to properly know how much carbon it's on them. We need to have a better estimate of carbon. And there is currently a gap between spatial scales. So usually biology and ecology's focus studies are only at smaller spatial scales, just a few meters or of tens of meters studies, while landscape or seascape ecology studies or remote sensing techniques use priority to larger areas, just kilometers. We need a connector between these two approaches to properly scale up or scale down our results. And there are some previous studies about spatial variability in salt marshes, but mostly focus in faunal components, in fishes, invertebrates, and birds. And there is almost no information about vegetation and soil, and it have received way less attention. And specifically for carbon, there is just few papers that talk about it. And if we focus on Virginia, this is from the Coastal Carbon Network. We can see, compared to all the other coastal states in the nation, that we have very low quality and quantity of data, and we need to improve this. These are soil cores and data available. So by 2021, only 6 scores were published in this database. This year, we are a little bit better, but still it's like 17 or less than 20. So we need to do a better job in this state. So my research objectives are to study carbon dynamics based on the spatial characteristics of salt marshes, specifically between patches, so how the patch characteristics of size and shape influence the carbon amounts that we found, and then intra-patch variability, so inside the patch, the difference between the edge and the interior zones, and then conduct some geospatial data analysis. So we expect to have in larger, more aggregated patches, higher amounts of carbon, and then in smaller and more fragmented patches, less amounts of carbon. And inside of each of these patches, we collected some information from the interior versus the exterior, so the edge portion of the patch. And we're expecting to have higher amounts of carbon in the interior compared to the edges. We are doing this in the lower Chesapeake Bay. These are the 4 sites that I took samples from last year. And for this presentation, I will focus only on 3 of them. One is Fragate Island Wildlife Management Area in Carrollton, then Grandview Nature Preserve in Hampton, and lastly, the Machicomoco State Park and Catlet Islands in Gloucester. So these 3 different sites have a lot of different patches with different sizes, all of them natural. So it was great sites to study this. Before we went to the field, I conducted these geospatial data analysis focusing on the spatial extent of marshes. And I discovered that the number of all salt marsh patches in Virginia, the larger, so that more than 10 hectares patches is only 3% of them. We have way more small and medium patches. And when we see the area of them, so we will have these larger patches represent 76% of the total area of salt marshes. And then when we see the perimeter, it's almost 50-50, even less. It's 46% for the larger ones. So what this could mean? Where here we're seeing a trend that maybe small and medium patches could be more susceptible to edge effect because of their perimeter area radio. And then it could be more susceptible to fragmentation and other issues. So it's also very important to see these relations. So I conducted this experimental design. We have, in this case, 3 different sites. We have 3 patches inside of them with different sizes and shapes, and then interior and edge zone, and then 3 different plots where we collected quadrats and cores, soil cores, and then we subdivide. We have subsections of these cores. Initial results, the plant species that are dominant here in all of sites are Spartina alterniflora and Juncus ramarianus, but we have other species like Spartina patens and Salicornia virginica and many others. And there is a difference between the interior. In the interior portion of them, we have higher diversity. So we have other species, and usually in the edge is only Spartina and Juncus. So this is how it looks, a little bit of the on the field work that we have. So collecting the soil cores, the quadrats with the above ground biomass information, and then we collect different edaphic conditions like the elevation. But just a reminder, today we're going to talk about the below ground biomass only for the results. But we collected 216 quadrats of above ground biomass, 72 root cores analyses, and 72 soil cores analyses that we are currently analyzing. And this is just preliminary results initially. Here we have carbon estimates for below ground biomass. We have the 3 different sites, so Grand View Nature Preserve, Machicomoco, and Ragged Island. We have different sizes, so large, medium, and small here on the right, and then the difference between the edge and interior zones. And the colors will tell us how aggregated or fragmented is each of these patches. If we see first the large patches, so well, they're the ones that are more aggregated, like in Grand View, we don't see much difference between the inner and the edge sections, and we see higher amounts of carbon. In the fragmented ones, apparently there is less carbon associated, and in the case for Machicomoco, we are seeing higher amount of carbon in the interior portion. When we see the small ones, in general, comparing with the larger ones, we see less amount of carbon in them. But we need to continue and include more analysis in this one. And we have some differences in the inner and edge portion. And then when we see the medium ones, there's some variability. And we have variability in general depending on each site, and we have different trends in each sites. So we have a strong influence from the location too, not just the sizes and the shapes. So if we focus more into the size portion of the below ground biomass that we analyze, we have some trends suggesting that the higher or the larger the patch is, higher amounts of carbon we will have, but we still need to include, remember, we have one more site to include in these results. So we will have more points here, but still we have some variability and some trends that we need to study further. And then when we see the shape complexity, it will depend on the equation we use. So in this first part of the graph, we have the ratio perimeter by area and also the carbon estimates here. So, and if we compare it to the isoperimetric equation, so it's another equation that uses as a circle with the same area and how different it is from the perimeter area ratio that we have in the real patch. We see some trends here too, but there is a lot of variability associated. So we need to include more points and we need to run more analysis, and just as a reminder, just preliminary results. But there are some trends here that are interesting and we need to continue to see. So in general, we have differences across sites between and inside patches, but it's a combination of shape and size that it's probably determining and driving these amounts of carbon that we are finding. And the next steps is, will we continue to study the above ground biomass and the sediments and soil, and included in this analysis. And the last site that I am analyzing from last year. Then this year, we will start collecting samples, and we will start another chapter of my dissertation. So focusing way more smaller scales. So in this variability between the edge and the interior zone, how this gradient is changing and what is driving this change at smaller scales. And then at bigger spatial scales, so conduct a spatial temporal change analysis from the 80s to now with satellite and aerial photography images to see the actual change and how much are we gaining or losing. And something that I'm very passionate about, it's the outreach portion. And I wanted to translate science to general audiences. And this is like very tied with the Virginia Sea Grant opportunities. So I want to create an interactive approach and use my research of spatial variability in salt marshes to conduct these two, so as to testing. So as science and in the scientific community, we have a lot of issues. Sometimes communicating can be a challenge. So we need to improve that to properly connect and properly explain what is our research about and what that matters to anyone else, not just us. So I want to co-develop solutions with different groups, with different target audiences, and create guidelines for effective communication with them. So after I have identified each of these target groups, we are going to share the information, and we will create together educational materials with climate change information and how the protection of salt marshes can contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. And we want to reach as many people as possible in general, not just in Virginia, but also in the world. So if we see this map, Virginia, it have more than 10% of the population that speaks Spanish, and most of them speak only Spanish. So the Hispanic population is growing a lot, and some people that are living here with us, even if it's sharing the same challenges of living in these coastal areas, they may not be aware about what's going on or how to face it. So we need to make available for the Spanish-speaking community all these resources too. And this is a little bit just the first trials of my educational programs that I am designing. The first picture here in the left is from the Rain in Science event. At ODU, we had more than 500 participants in them through the weekend. It was amazing, an amazing opportunity. I had this model showing how wave attenuation can be done with protecting salt marshes and oysters. We have some Spartina plants here, and then some posters and explaining and engaging. So it was very a wonderful engagement community event. And this is another picture with the same model, but in this case, we had some mangrove species and showing other research that we have in our lab. It was in the Rhine Resilience Lab of the Elizabeth River Project in the Open House. So it has been an amazing opportunity to share this. And also some other things that I have been doing, just talk about my life as an international student, as a woman in science, and just as a researcher in podcasts of my friends, and in Spanish and English. So it's good to just showcase and have more people interest in these topics, and just a broader audience, not just science, but also anyone else that might be interested. And I want to thank everyone who have supported during my research and in my fieldwork sampling. So it's very challenging, but it's great to have this amazing group of people supporting me, and all the funding sources, sea grants, of course, for these 2 years of financial support, and the Paul Killick Wetland Research Award, the Virginia Association of Wetland Professionals, and the Rising Tides programs of SERC. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much to all three of our presenters, and I would just like to say kudos for not just doing research, but doing outreach and engagement and all kinds of other stuff to help not just create knowledge, but also help with the dissemination and engagement with that knowledge.